Hello. All right. Honored Grand Hall. Ärade Storsal. First of all, it is so great to see that all of you have showed up here tonight to join us at this event. In case of fire, the emergency exits are one in the back and two on each side. Also, please don't stand or sit in the stairs closest to the stage. In these interesting times, where an NSA-supported surveillance base at Hønefoss in Norway has been uncovered, and Norway's capabilities of surveilling all over the globe has become public knowledge, our guest is extremely relevant. Edward Snowden, for some, is the name of a traitor and a danger to national security. For others, it's the name of a hero and a human rights activist willing to put his life on the line to ensure that the rest of us know to which extent we are being watched, tracked, and surveilled. But to exactly what extent are we being watched? Is surveillance necessary to protect us from terrorist attacks? Or are we seeing the beginning of a society where the state has total power? How can you resist a state which knows what you do, who you meet, and when you do it? From his asylum in Russia, Mr. Snowden will join us directly here tonight. He will enlighten us on how he came to take the most difficult choice possible, what the state actually are capable of, and what the future might bring. And perhaps most importantly, what can we do to affect this situation? With us tonight, we got Amnesty London's senior technologist, Claudio Guarneri. He will be our moderator and hold the conversation with Mr. Snowden. Please give him a warm welcome. All right. My name is Synnøve Verede, and on the behalf of Amnesty Norway and the Student Society in Trondheim, we are proud and honored to finally introduce you to Mr. Edward Snowden.
Hello, Amnesty. Hello, Norway.
Well, hello, Ed. Welcome to Norway. How are you doing?
Thank you. I wish I could be there in person.
Hopefully next year. So, well, firstly, I have to tell you how many people are here tonight. There's hundreds of people. I don't know if you can see us. If you can't see us, you can probably hear us. And it's amazing how much support there is. There is literally not one free spot. It's people standing and sitting all over the place, so it's amazing. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to have about an hour of conversation, and I'm going to ask some questions. Other people, students, will ask you some questions too. And I want to start off right off the bat with, kind of with a question starting as a conclusion in a way. So, on 5th of June 2013, The Guardian published the first article that came out through your revelations and through the exposures that you brought forward. And so we're kind of approaching very soon a 5th year anniversary. Although it feels it was almost yesterday, actually some time has passed. So the first question for you is what is your balance now in a sense of how things have improved or how things have gotten worse in this debate over surveillance and on privacy since all of it started?
Yeah, so this is a very difficult question because so much has changed. Now, people might go, well, we still have the same problems, or we still have agencies breaking the law, we still have Facebook and Google becoming more aggressive, and it's absolutely true. But the difference is now we know, right? We understand that the most powerful government in the world, and one that most people have traditionally considered the champion of an open and free society, was actually breaking its own rules, and not just against people that you might agree with, right? Looking at people in war zones, targeting terrorists specifically, but engaging in this new kind of mass surveillance, the indiscriminate surveillance of communications in bulk as they cross the internet, wherever they are moving electronically naked or unencrypted, as we call it. They were being collected, they were being stored, they were being searched through, and this continues today. But because we know what's happening, now we see individuals, technologists, groups like Amnesty advocating for reforms to the law, demanding new protections from technology companies. We see technologists and young people, students working in universities on new projects to integrate technical solutions to what have always been political problems. Now, technology will not fix all of our problems, but if we can start to use it as another lever, as another means of enforcing human rights in ways that we could not before, where a technologist, one of you in the audience in Norway, develops a system that can be applied to the internet, that can be applied to any computer freely and openly. And it can also protect people, opposition activists in Russia, human rights activists in China, journalists in Africa. We can protect people all around the world as long as we know what the threats are. And this is critical, right? And this is the biggest thing that's changed. People will say, well, we knew these things were possible before 2013, and that's absolutely true. In fact, there was even some level of reporting that, at least in the United States, the government had been engaged in these kind of activities, but no one had been able to prove it. And it is this distance, the distance between allegation and fact, that allows us to actually act, to change our behaviors, to change our priorities, and begin to pressure systems, political systems, to change. And if they do not change, to begin to change the world using technology to better suit our needs.
So we have a first question from, can you hear me? Yes. We have a first question from one of the students. Who's signed up? Okay, it's coming.
Hi, Storsalen. My name is Rodrigo and I am a student.
Nice to meet you.
Snowden, first of all, I would like to thank you for your courage. As you once said, you knew that you would be made to suffer for your actions. You gave up a great degree of your freedom without guarantee of extensive results for a cause you believed in. And this is one of the most admirable things a person can do. Back in 2013, you stated that you hoped your actions would embolden others to step forward when they saw wrongdoing. Now, after almost 5 years since you leaked the NSA documents, I wonder how you feel about what has happened since. So, in relation to what you first imagined or expected, have people come out with information that should be made public? Have whistleblower protection programs improved? And finally, could you mention anything that you think is missing the attention and support from the public?
Yeah, so there's a lot in there. But when we look at all of it, the central themes are about whistleblowers, and are we actually hearing more of the truth now? Are we getting more facts now than we were before? And it's a mixed result, because of course we saw there's a tremendous effort on the part of my government in the United States to prevent this. But despite that, despite sort of the extreme kind of persecution that we have seen from groups like the CIA, the NSA, and their allies in the US legislature and Congress, even the actions of President Obama, who most people would think was one of the better US presidents in terms of respect for liberal rights. But you have to remember, this is a guy who campaigned on closing Guantanamo. He campaigned on ending warrantless wiretapping, but instead he expanded the warrantless wiretapping program. He said we weren't going to do the same kind of unlawful killing that the Bush administration did. But in just his last year in office, 2016, he authorized more than 26,000 drone strikes, I believe. And this is not to say, Obama's the problem. It's to point out that if even this sort of constitutional law professor who becomes president can be such an enemy of the free press, and this is not just coming from the position of a whistleblower, the former executive editor of the New York Times, Jill Abramson, this is the largest newspaper in the US, said she had never seen a White House more secretive than Obama's. She's no longer there. I think she might see that things have gotten even worse, but for the fact that the current White House is pretty incompetent all around. But what is the result of this? What is the outcome of this? Power has never been more comfortable in trying to keep secrets from the public, right? Government no longer wants to be partner to the public. They want to rule over the public in many parts of the world. This is not edge to edge. It's unevenly distributed, but we see this impulse growing. And the costs, unfortunately, for whistleblowers are beginning to grow. I faced life in prison or worse. Just the charges they put against me the day after my name was sort of revealed, I think it was about a week after I was revealed, were 30 years in prison. And that was on a per document basis. Every single fact that you tell a journalist, right? Not that costs a life, not that harms national security, not that you're selling to a foreign spy, just what you tell a journalist that the government says you're not allowed to do in the United States will get you 10 years in prison per fact. That's a problem, but that's the law. In the EU, we have seen calls for better whistleblower protections. In fact, EU Parliament passed a resolution that even said people like myself should be protected against retaliation by member states. But Europe has had difficulty moving this from a consensus amongst the public and even amongst sort of the broader parliament of the Union and into law in each of the member states. And this is because once you get to the level of each nation, you get spy services in each country. They go, ooh, we don't want that. If people knew what we were doing, that might raise questions. That might cost careers. That might lead to embarrassment or prison for us. So when you look at those dynamics, it seems that we should have no hope at all. And yet, despite that, we actually see outrageous acts of truth-telling in the places where the consequences are the most dire and the most sure. Certainly, you may have heard about the Russian doping scandal in the Olympics, right? We have Russian doctors who have come forward to talk about this. We have in the United States national security whistleblowers, a woman allegedly working at the same national security agency that I did, who was concerned about these stories of Russian election interference and the new White House administration saying, oh, this didn't happen, don't worry about it, we would never do that. And it's all made up. It's some fat guy in his basement. But she saw a document that, rightly or wrongly, she believed the public needed to know about, that was from the NSA. And they said, this is part of what we know and why we think we know it. And here's the assessment that we came to provide. At least this is what the government says happened when they charged her. And she's sitting in prison now because of it. That's an unfortunate thing. But the fact is, whistleblowers cannot be threatened into silence. Because in many cases, in almost all cases, the individuals who are engaged in this know it is more likely than not to be an act of self-immolation. You're lighting yourself on fire for the betterment of your country, of your community, of your planet. But it doesn't have to be this way, and we should not accept that it must be this way. And if we want to see a better world, if we want to have access to the truth, we must create mechanisms whereby those who have the truth can tell us the truth without us throwing them into the volcano. Because if we don't, we will find ourselves with no one who is willing to tell us the truth when we need it the most.
So Ed, I said earlier that it's been already 5 years since the first documents, the first articles came out, and one thing that is somewhat surprising but also reassuring is that there are still articles coming out from the documents that he provided to journalists. And most recently, one was published by The Intercept on the cooperation between NSA and Norwegian intelligence. And this article kind of exposed the presence of a surveillance base that was built in cooperation with NSA. And so the question, I guess, would be, there's been similar revelations coming out from different countries. Why do you think this sort of discovery is important for the Norwegian public to know, and why, especially, if you can explain, why there is this even cross-border cooperation between intelligence agencies could be problematic, especially if the own public, their own citizens don't even know about it?
Okay, so for those in the audience who aren't familiar with this, this is a reference to a story that was published just a few days ago about this secret spy base in Norway that was constructed with technology that was provided by the US National Security Agency, right? Our electronic surveillance agency, basically our internet spying organization. They also listen to things that are being transmitted over radio waves through satellites, which is traditionally what they used to do when that was the bulk of intelligence. Now, in secret, without the public in Norway really getting a vote or understanding what was going on, having any ability to debate whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, the direction they want to go, intelligence services in Norway secretly approached the NSA around 2001. And there's a long history in every country in Europe and elsewhere around the world, many places, where these countries go, we want to do more things. We want to spy on more people. We want more capabilities, but it might not be legal in Norway or wherever. We can't ask the parliament to just let us hire these people to create this, because then they'll have questions we don't want to do. But maybe we can go to our allied intelligence services. Maybe we can go to the US and see, can they help us out? Can the Brits help us out? Can we start trading our accesses, sort of our spy dossiers, the information that we've collected with each other, like baseball cards, and come to an exchange? And this is what happened. They got a little bit of technology 2 years later, sort of on a provisional basis from the NSA, for spying on satellites, basically. The problem is, you can't spy on satellites the way that you spy on a general in some foreign country by tapping their phone. You can't spy on a single terrorist with a radar dish the same way that you can by sending a human agent after them. Instead, what you're doing is you're collecting everything that's coming down out of the air. And that means you're collecting a tremendous amount of innocent individuals' communications as well. And this is what started to happen. Once they had this initial capability, they went, well, we're finding some really interesting things in this. And if we trust the statements of the intelligence officials who say, look, this is primarily being used for protecting Norwegian military forces out in Afghanistan or whatever, fine, fair enough, all right, we believe you, let's take that for granted. But even if that is the case, right, they're doing everything absolutely correctly, here's what the problem becomes. The public, even most members of the Norwegian government, were being misled about what the purpose of this base was. I think just a few years ago, perhaps actually last year, one of the Norwegian defense ministers was visiting this base, and she came out and said, the purpose of this base is to allow us to communicate with ships at sea for our own military, not that it's for spying on people, not that it's being used for surveillance, not that it's increasingly year after year expanding its scope to eventually encompass the communications of people in Norway. And now the intelligence services in Norway are very careful to say, well, it's not our job and we're not interested on spying to spy on Norwegians in Norway, talking to Norwegians in Norway. But we absolutely do collect what's called the metadata of their communications. This means who you call, when you call them, who your associates are, social graphs and things like that, for anybody who's communicating across the Norwegian border. And I don't need to tell you that almost everyone who's in Norway communicates in some manner across the border. If you're connecting to Facebook, you're going across the border. If you're connecting to Google, you're going across the border. And the Norwegian intelligence services, when this story has come out, have simply said, well, we're not spying on Norwegians in Norway talking to Norwegians in Norway, right? We're not spying on wholly domestic communications. And to some people, that might sound reassuring, but it raises a lot of questions, the most central of which is, are Norwegians the only ones who have rights? Does a German have rights? Does an Afghan person have rights? You know, does a Russian, as unpopular as they are today, do they have rights? How about an American? If we're going to have fundamental rights, if we're going to have a right to privacy, we have to recognize that no one's right means anything unless everyone's right means something. If every country in the world is saying, I can spy on every other country, but not on my own country, we are not making things better, we are making things worse. We're simply saying we have to outcompete every other country in the spy game, and that's a race to the bottom. One last point on this before we move on. And that's the question of these intelligence services' response to this reporting. Again, they went, we're not spying on wholly domestic communications, but we are collecting metadata. And yes, that may implicate some Norwegian citizens, but only the ones who are communicating overseas. However, even though the Norwegian parliament has some questions about this, the oversight bodies have some questions about the legality of this, they go, don't worry, because we are drafting a new law. The intelligence services are working with the oversight committee to create a new law that will make everything they're doing legal. Now, the oversight bodies are saying this is a good thing. The intelligence services are saying this is a good thing. But we need to look at something fundamental here, and that is the question of who in society decides what the law should be. Is it the public? Is it the full body of the legislature? Or is it surveillance agencies? Is it spies? What is happening is they're saying, well, the oversight committee looked at our activities and they found some things are not entirely legal. Maybe they're flagrantly illegal. Maybe they're only a little illegal, but they're certainly not completely authorized by the law. Because of this, we're not going to stop what we're doing. We're going to change the law so that it is now legal in the future. And ladies and gentlemen, that may be all right. That may be something you want. You may want these surveillance agencies to spy on you as long as it's only when you're communicating with someone in Afghanistan, because maybe you're a conduit for a terrorist, right? And you may be willing to give that up. But if we are going to do that, which I strongly disagree with the proposition that this is the proper direction, if we are going to agree to that, that fundamentally must be an open and public decision that's arrived at as a result of an open and public debate. That has not happened in Norway, and it has not happened meaningfully in any other country where these laws have been changed. Germany has changed its laws, France has changed its laws, the UK has changed its laws, the United States has changed its laws. And in all of these cases, they have tried in one way or another to expand the surveillance powers of these agencies. And that's because the intelligence agencies were given special treatment in the debate. They were allowed to only talk in closed sessions. They were allowed to abuse their powers of classification, of making information secret so you could not tell what's going on. And I should stop here because we have limited time, but I would say, ladies and gentlemen, watch this very, very carefully. It's not to say this is the final day of rights and, tomorrow will be Armageddon. But don't focus on the surveillance scandal. Focus on the democracy scandal that it is revealing.
There's so much to talk about on this subject, but we have a little time and we need to move on to some more tough questions from the students. So we'll have the next one for you.
Hi, my name's Marit. I'm also a student. I'm wondering, what's your opinion on the accusations of Russian meddling in the last presidential election in the US? And in addition to that, WikiLeaks' role in that?
Sure. So this is, again, a big one. I'll try to cover it a little bit more briefly because a lot of people have talked about this. Did Russia meddle in the US elections? Probably. Can we prove it? No, and that's the problem. Can the US government prove it? Almost certainly. They say they have arrived at a consensus. But if that is the case, why has this information not been made public? We see a lot of independent information researchers who show a lot of compelling circumstantial evidence. But the problem is this, right? This is kind of a technologist's thing, but we have a rule, PCAPs or it didn't happen. What that means in English for non-technologists is when you are spying on the entire internet, you have a record of attacks like this. You actually have a network capture from when this happened. It is not a question of if these captures exist, because that's what the stories of 2013 was about. The government in the United States has these capabilities, and we know they have these capabilities. They don't want to prove that they have them, and the question is why. They will argue it's because, well, if we show that we have these capabilities, they'll no longer function. They won't work anymore. But that's not actually true when it's a fundamental capability like monitoring all the fiber optic entryways into your country and exit points out of your country. Everything has to go through the toll booth on the road, right? And it all passes the camera, it all gets photographed, whether they like it or not, whether they know about it or not. The reason that they're not revealing this information publicly, I believe, is because if they do, we can challenge it in court in the United States. And these activities are unlawful in the United States. And the only reason the courts in the United States have not ruled on the legality of these programs is because the government has gone, we're not doing it. And if we are doing it, it's classified, and then you can't prove it. So even when we're talking about a matter of such enormous public interest as foreign interference in our domestic elections, they're going, we're not willing to prove whether this is happening or not, regardless of the costs, because it would show that we're breaking the law, and we want to be able to continue breaking the law. I don't believe that's the way governments should operate. Now, does that excuse Russia? Of course not, right? We don't want any government interfering in another sovereign country's elections. But another thing that we should understand is the frequency with which this has happened. Is this the first time that Russia has interfered in an election overseas? The New York Times in February did a report looking at roughly the last 50 years of history, I think 1946 to the year 2000. And they found that Russia or the Soviet Union had interfered in foreign elections in 36 different occasions. And in the same time, they found the United States had interfered in foreign elections 81 times, more than twice as often. Now, this doesn't mean it's okay that Russia does it because we do it too. What this means is, why are we talking about why is it different this time? Why is it spectacularly evil this time? And it was okay all of these other times. What we need to be focusing on is how to make this stop across the board for all of these different countries. How do we make great powers respect the choice of citizens? How do we make them stop trying to influence the outcomes of public decisions of which they are not a part? And if we do not do this, right, why does this matter? Why is this a big deal? Because we are incentivizing conflict if we allow the status quo to continue. If we just point fingers and go, it's only bad when the other person does it, but it's a good thing when we do it, we are ensuring that every country is going to try to do this again and again and again, year after year. They're just going to try to get better at it. They're going to try not to get caught. They're going to learn from their mistakes last time and do it again and again and again. The last point of that question was the role of WikiLeaks, of course, and this is a reference, I think, to publishing Hillary Clinton and the DNC's emails. And this is a simpler question, because whether you like WikiLeaks or not, this was a newsworthy event. Every major newspaper in the United States published stories about the WikiLeaks material. They did it continuously for a number of months. And the real thing that we need to look at here is not, is WikiLeaks an organization full of heroes or an organization full of villains? No, because the answer is it actually doesn't matter. The motives behind journalism are less important than the conclusions of journalism that are actually supported by facts. The real question we need to be asking ourselves is, would you rather not know what's really going on?
Yeah, so speaking of hacking, when we talk about surveillance, we make a distinction between kind of passive surveillance, active surveillance. There's different forms of surveillance. With passive surveillance, we speak about the interception of traffic and data as it goes through the wire, and with active surveillance, we generally mean the hacking into devices and infecting devices with agents to rather get the data off of our computers or off of our phones directly. And as encryption is becoming more and more popular, and it's being implemented in many more places at an even protocol level, and in a way, the old form of surveillance we could say, is getting close to become obsolete in some way, at least kind of the full wiretapping. And so, in that regard, we, especially in the last 5 years, we saw a lot of increase into the use of hacking and into the use of spyware and exploits and all of these kinds of things by law enforcement and by intelligence agencies in order to conduct surveillance. And so I'm wondering, how do you see this as a problem in different sense? We're seeing a lot of countries starting to introduce regulations to allow their law enforcement and their intelligence agencies to do this more systematically and more legitimately, quote unquote. So this is kind of becoming common. So is this going to be the new frontier of surveillance, in your opinion, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, I would say it already has become, unfortunately, quite routine in investigations, at least in richer countries that can afford to pay for software exploits. For those in the audience who aren't very technical, we're talking about hacking techniques. Any law enforcement agency, police, spy service, right now, today, can buy hacking techniques that will work against the iPhone in your pocket, that will work against your Android phone, that will work against your home laptop. And if they don't exist on the shelf, they can commission these companies to research until they find and develop one for them. And this is quite expensive, but it's become a whole industry unto itself. And we see a number of companies that are trying to evade international attention and really ultimately compliance with the law internationally and the public desire to see our devices secure, because what we're talking about when we're talking about these governments call them law enforcement, lawful interception techniques or lawful hacking techniques or lawful exploitation. What we're actually talking about is making every device in the world less secure as long as you have money. Whereas in reality, we should be trying to find and identify these weaknesses in our systems and then correct them. You can think of a leak in a pipe and then put a patch over it so it no longer leaks. We're either all secure or none of us are secure, because the way these techniques function is if your iPhone is vulnerable, everyone else's iPhone in the world is vulnerable as well. It doesn't matter whether they're a Russian general who's in charge of a nuclear service or whether they're a reporter trying to work on a human rights issue in China, and the Chinese government wants to buy the same technique to monitor those people. But what does this mean, and should this be sort of the status quo? As you say, Claudio, we are getting better as a society around the world, internationally today, about taking all these communications that are transiting electronically naked, unencrypted, and armoring them as they cross that hostile path. So not just anybody can look at them. Before, many years ago, everything that crossed the internet was unencrypted. Today, out of the top sites, it's something like only 20 to 30% of communications are unencrypted. So of course, now everybody's trying to use hacking. Spies are trying to hack, cops are trying to hack. But we need to think about, in a well-ordered society, in a liberal and open world order, do we want cops to be acting like criminals as a matter of routine? Do we want our government to be attacking insecurities and making our society, our devices less safe, less reliable, just so their job's a little bit easier? I would argue no. And just the final point here, because there are, of course, people in the Norwegian intelligence service right now who are getting a live feed of this talk probably. And they're going, oh, that sounds terrible. We can't spy on them just by looking at what's crossing the internet, and we can't hack their phones. We can't hack their laptops. Oh, whatever shall we do? Real criminals, legitimate criminals, terrorists, kidnappers, bomb makers, we won't be able to track them. And to even people like myself, that's a persuasive argument, right? We want our police to be able to thwart legitimate crimes, serious crimes. We want them to be able to do life-saving work. But just because they don't have a magic button that lets them unlock a perfect record of every private life in society does not mean they can't do their job. For this, I'll use the example of the Silk Road administrator. For those who aren't familiar with this, this was a sort of dark web drug market that operated for many years. It was quite famous. You buy any drug you wanted sort of anonymously over the internet. But there was a problem for the people who were investigating him, right? If you're one of those who believe that selling drugs should be a crime. He used encryption, right? He used anonymous routing techniques online to try to make himself invulnerable against these commonly used police techniques. And they couldn't find a way into his systems, allegedly, as far as we know. And yet they found him, they arrested him, and he's sitting in jail today. So the question is why? If all of his communications were encrypted, if they couldn't break into his devices, how did they do their job? And it is the same answer that explains how police have been able to do their job at every level of technology in human history. You know, from the invention of the wheel or fire or writing to where they are today. Good old-fashioned police work, a little bit of human ingenuity will get you around any problem. They found this person was operating out of public libraries, doing his criminal work. They got two police officers to stand to his left, acting like a husband or wife. They pretended to have an argument. He turns his head to the left with his laptop full of all of his encrypted material open, unlocked with the password entered, and an agent to his right simply picks it up and walks away with it. There will always be ways for police to do their work. That is not a reason, let's put this more simply. Free societies do not restructure the rights that the public is entitled to for the convenience of spies and police.
So just a kind of a brief follow-up to that. Especially as we see what you just explained in all of these new developments in digital security and in surveillance becoming even more problematic in a way as a kind of reaction to this adoption of encryption all over the place, which is great, of course, by all means. Now things are kind of shifting, and as you just described. So when it comes to kind of protecting ourselves and protecting others too, people that we communicate with, and especially if we're journalists or activists and so on, often we hear about, we should use this tool or you should use that tool. For example, in many cases, many examples would be you should use Tor, you should use Signal, which are extremely popular apps. How much do you think in kind of the long run, as a strategic choice, is it really the best strategy? And also, you've been working in the last few years in building tools for protecting journalists, so you have a direct experience of that. How much of what is the better strategy in this sense? Is it to kind of have the public participate with us in some kind of digital resistance and kind of opt into all of these counter-surveillance tools? Or should we rather kind of have structural changes at a deeper level, and in that perhaps have kind of the big technology vendors be more respectful of our privacy and be more participant to building better technology for the future? How do you see kind of things developing in this sense?
Well, I think largely you answered your own question. We don't want everybody in society to have to become a technologist in order to be safe online. It is a crazy, broken world when you have to think, how can I communicate with my mom without having somebody able to intercept the call, without leaving a record with Google, without Facebook knowing forever where I was at this day at this time? But that's the world we live in right now. I'll tell you what we need to learn from the spy agencies. And this is as a result of watching sort of the failed reforms in country after country. Civil society groups will try to bargain with the spies. And they'll go, mass surveillance, bulk collection of communications going across the wire is a fundamental violation of human rights. You must not do it. And the spies will go, well, if we can't do that, we can't do our job. Can we hack people instead? And the human rights activists will go, well, if you're hacking people, at least you have to target people. You have to go, I want to hack this guy, or hack everybody who arrives at this server. Not just I see everything for everyone that goes across the pipe. So that's an improvement. All right, you can hack, but you can't spy on everyone. And the intelligence agencies go, that's great, wonderful, we'll take that deal and move on. And then they go back in secret and they do both. They continue doing mass surveillance secretly, unlawfully. They just sort of change their legal interpretation to say this is now legal, or they do what the Norwegians are doing right now, where they go, well, you caught us, but we're going to change the law, so now it's going to be legal in the future. And oh, by the way, that hacking that you gave up to us, we're going to continue doing that because you made it legal. You said that was all right as part of the bargain. The thing is, whenever they have a choice, whenever they're asked to make a choice between one technique and another, they take both. We need to do the same. If we are being asked, should we choose between political reform as our best technique or creating technical tools that allow users to protect themselves no matter what the law says, or should we get technology companies to fundamentally reshape the way the internet works? The answer is we have to do all of them, because that's the only way we're going to make headway. That's the only way we're going to make progress. That is the only way we're going to create a secure and reliable internet that protects everyone.
So moving on to kind of a different form of surveillance, we have the next question from the student. So please join us.
Hi, Mr. Snowden. My name is Chitli, and I'm a Fulbright researcher here in Trondheim. And my question for you is, do you think that the private sector, tech giants like Google and Facebook, are actually more of a threat to our data privacy than the government is?
It's a great question and an important one. This is one that Americans particularly struggle with because in the EU, there are privacy laws, right? It sounds funny that should be a thing, but there are about 100 different countries around the world that have privacy laws. The United States is not one of them. Soon you'll get your general data protection regulation. Things are not perfect. Things are actually still quite bad, but they're getting better, little bits and pieces. The US, there's a big question where these commercial structures, these US internet service providers, companies, social media platforms are largely unlimited in the kind of choices they can make, the ways they can use and abuse private details about your life without really your knowledge or permission or consent. They would argue, well, you clicked that little box, but let's be honest, nobody read that. And let's be honest, even if they wanted to, they couldn't, because it changes all the time. And there have actually been studies showing that even if someone read that for every product they buy, every piece of software they use, every website they go to, there are not enough hours in the year to review all of the documents and legal agreements that you're made to agree to just to engage in basic tasks in daily life. So there is a real question here. Government in the United States is still the biggest threat in a certain way, which is that they can put you in jail, right? In countries that have the death penalty, they can kill you. Companies can't directly. But more and more, the level of influence that they have over ordinary people's lives is increasing, particularly as we start to see the level of data, the amount of data that they've collected, the way they're using it and applying it in new ways. They're using algorithms to make concrete decisions about our lives. Ultimately, whether we're talking about grants of credit, who gets a job and who does not, whose voice is made heard on a platform and whose voice is silenced. They are shaping the future of our world. And they are largely, and unfortunately, I hate to say this, but increasingly not accountable to public and society more broadly. The question is, how do we fix that without causing more harm than we sought to prevent?
Yeah, and just quickly on this, it feels also that all of these big tech companies, Google and Facebook and so on, have kind of developed a new internet, a very convenient internet where all of us can have free services that we can do pretty much anything we want without paying, $1. How much of this also is a problem in terms of being bought into a system of self-surveillance? So we're kind of surveilling each other by tagging each other's photos and Instagramming every single moment of our lives and sharing so much. Is this part of the problem, or the problem really is on the responsibility alone of the company? Is it also part of our own responsibility?
I mean, I think this is a really important question. Perhaps one of the most important questions of our generation. Is the individual permitted to sell themselves? And I think the only way that we can look at this, because this is a really charged landscape, is how has this worked in the past? Now, using Facebook is not the same thing as slavery, and I'm not trying to make that comparison. But slavery was abolished for a reason, even in countries where you could voluntarily indenture yourself into another person's service. It's because it's a fundamental violation of human rights when this is done against someone's will. But it is still a violation of rights, even if they volunteer for it. And this is the question of fundamental human dignity. This is an understanding that some people can be exploited. People can fall on hard times. People can become desperate. Should that doom them? Should that be the last bad decision they can ever make before they are completely dependent and exploited by a company or a class or an individual or anything else? And I would argue this is what we really need to think about. It is human psychology. By itself has fundamental weaknesses. We know that people don't make rational decisions all the time. We know we ourselves make bad decisions. That's why we don't all look like we belong on the cover of a magazine, right? I want a six-pack as much as everybody else, guys, but I also love cupcakes. But it goes beyond that. And that is the inequality of our experiences. Anybody can look around the world today and see global inequality is rising, and it is reaching a point of crisis. Saying that, well, people can make their own choices, which is reasonable, and then adding on the end of it, no matter what, no matter how badly they're getting screwed, no matter how obvious it is, and they can never revoke their consent. They can never escape from the system once they've gone into it. That's where it starts to sound a little bit crazy. And the reason is this. If we have a world of global inequality today, and it's getting worse, and you opt into a system today that makes you subject to that system, and now that system has largely unlimited understanding of your thought processes, who your friends are, where you work, where you spend your money, the kind of books you read, the kind of things that make you laugh, the kind of things that you hate. They know you better than you know yourself. And as year after year after year, they get better at using this information against you or to shape your decisions. Ultimately, you start to work for them, even if you're not being paid for it, even if you think you're getting benefit from it in the form of free email or funny cat pictures. But when we say that because someone agreed to it once, they can never revoke their consent, they can never extricate themselves from the system, what we are doing is locking into place a system of global inequality that when it came to be, we did not have a full understanding of the facts of how that world worked, of who would benefit from it. And this is why we have democracy. We have to understand that not everyone's going to be an expert, right? But our voices matter. And if we have the right to give all of our power away, whether that be economically, whether that be politically, whether that be socially or through anything else, to some company or some government, and we suffer for the rest of our lives from that, that may be many things, ladies and gentlemen, but that is not freedom.
So in many interviews that I see of yours, you say something that I very much agree with and that I often say myself, and which is in sum that caring about privacy and caring about surveillance isn't just about caring about ourselves, but it's also an act of solidarity towards others, and especially towards those that are less privileged than us. And as you mentioned that before, we often hear about European and American companies kind of providing and enabling surveillance for other countries, often countries that don't have a lot of rule of law or where people are fighting for democracy or where there's oppression in some form. And so this room there's a lot of students here and also a lot of engineering students, so future engineers of tomorrow. And as briefly as it possibly can be, because we're kind of running out of time, but what would be, firstly, do you think we have a responsibility in doing our job as engineers and building technology in towards how it is being used. So are we also responsible in how it is being used? And in that regard, do you have a message for the engineers of tomorrow from Trondheim on, how can you contribute to this fight that you started?
Every one of you in the audience right now who is a technology student, engineering student, you're looking at sciences, you're working with math, anything like that, even if you're in soft sciences, right? Take a minute and look around at the world. Look at the way you're gathered right now. This conversation that we're having right now would not have been possible in any other generation that has lived throughout human history. I'm in exile. I cannot travel. Right? I'm not in asylum. People think I'm in asylum. I'm not in asylum. I'm in exile. And what that means is you shouldn't be able to hear what I have to say, and yet you can. The old bad tools of political repression that have existed for generations are beginning to fail. And the reason for that is technology. Everybody who has lived throughout the story of humanity has lived in changing times. But we live in times where things are shifting catastrophically, enormously, tectonically, whether we're talking about the climate and the future of humanity, the sea level, whether we're talking about warfare, whether we're talking about economics and where money is going, control of resources, or whether we're talking about speech. Technology is the most important political force of the last 100 years. And you are the ones who are going to decide what effect that has on the next 100 years. I would argue you don't just have the power to change the world with this. You don't just have sort of a right to do this. You do have an obligation. You have a duty to think about the kind of world, the kind of rights that you yourself inherited from past generations. Think about what you loved about it. Think about what's important to them, what's important to you. And then think about what you want to leave to the people who come after you. Because if you guys get this wrong, they're not going to have the power to change it in the same way that you do right now.
So we're almost run out of time, but we have one last question from the students, and probably is the biggest question of all, so please.
Hi, Mr. Snowden. My name is Christina, and my question to you is, what is your definition of freedom of speech?
This is a challenge because I think there is no simple agreement on what free speech is and what it means. Rather than defining it strictly, I want to look at what it means in different places. In the United States, they like to say that freedom of speech is absolute. You can say anything, anywhere, which is distinct from actually a largely consensus European viewpoint, which is free speech has larger limits. When you look at a place like Germany, for example, prohibition on things like swastikas, Nazi salutes. These are understandable desires, right? People want to reduce hate speech, hate crime around the world. We also see social media companies being deputized by governments around the world to take a quasi-governmental role to limit what can and cannot be said. Now, this came out initially as sort of a fight against the recruitment of people for ISIS, trying to counter terrorism, which again are drives that we should all be sympathetic to. Now we see it, there's a new kind of passion and explosion of things happening where everything on the internet is now a Russian bot, right? Everybody on Twitter is sort of trying to change your mind. It's a warped thing instead of just an idiot who's got a dumb opinion. Some of them are bots, right? But the question is, who decides what can and cannot be said? And where should those lines be drawn? Even in the United States, that place where freedom of speech is absolute, right? It's not. And how do I know? Because I can't go home because of something that I said. The government says if you know one of their secrets and you tell a journalist, you go to jail. It doesn't matter why you did it. You're not even allowed to tell the jury why you did it. The jury is not allowed to make a decision as to whether what you did was right or wrong morally. The only question that they are permitted to ask is, did you say something the government said you could not? If the answer is yes, you go to jail. Now, many people would say, just like countering terrorists and preventing sort of foreign subversion of domestic political processes, this is a legitimate government activity. Maybe it is. But I would argue that these things are not entirely consistent with freedom of speech. And the question is this. All of these are examples of where speech can theoretically cause harm. And so what the government has sought to do in so many different places is go, well, you can have freedom of speech in this context, but not that. Freedom of speech is conditional. But if it's conditional, it's not really a right. And this is what we need to think about. What are the limitations on speech? And I would argue that all limitations on speech, even those that are well-intentioned and put together by well-meaning people, inevitably result in causing greater harms than those they sought to prevent. The prohibition against talking about state secrets in the United States is what allowed the growth of mass surveillance we see today. It was born and raised in the United States. And because it is functionally unlawful in the United States under our Constitution, these programs could not have gotten off the ground in the way they did without secrecy. Now, beyond sort of what I was saying, and I know, not everything in the world needs to be viewed through this lens of surveillance. We need to think about, okay, are rights absolute? And any lawyer will tell you no. But are there some rights that are absolute? Can there be any circumstances where we go, even if the government wants to interfere in a person's private life, they should not be able to do so? And this is the great problem of democracy. Balancing the social desires of the public at large with the private needs of the individual whose beliefs, whose opinions, whose identity, whose needs may be contrary to that of the majority. And if you take only one thing away from our talk here tonight, I would ask you to remember this basic, fundamental, and I would say even obvious argument that so many people seem to have forgotten. The majority cannot vote away the rights of the minority. If they could, democracy wouldn't mean anything. If they could, rights wouldn't really be rights. There has to be some inherent level of right to the self, recognizing that an individual has their own value, that their voice has its own value. And that is why they have a freedom of speech, because we recognize that every person has something to say, that freedom of belief only has meaning because you have the space privately in confidence with your family, with your friends, with yourself in a book to figure out what it is that you actually believe. The whole reason that we require people to have fair trials, that you have a right to a fair trial, to due process, as they call it in the United States, is because we recognize you have a right to yourself, that the society is trying to overcome adversarially. If you did not have that right, why have trials at all, right? The courts are appointed by the government, which is appointed by the people. Whatever the court decides, whatever the police officer decides, they could discharge it. But we don't do that here. And we should not do that anywhere. And that is because of that fundamental kernel, That fundamental understanding that there are some lines that cannot be crossed. And then I would ask you to consider, why is that? And we all may have different answers, but I would argue that thing that we are trying to describe, that fundamental kernel that gives everyone a right to themselves, from which every other right derives, even self-defense. Why can't someone commit violence against you? Because you belong to you. You don't belong to them. They have no claim to you. There is a word for that, ladies and gentlemen, and that is privacy. Privacy is the right to the self. Thank you. I really want to come to know you.
Edward, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for everything you've done, and especially for continuing on fighting for a right to privacy and for rights of all whistleblowers around the world. We really hope to see you in person next year here in Trondheim. Most of all, we really hope that you're going to manage to go home at some point, hopefully soon. But before leaving, I wish all of you to thank you also for joining us, and let's give the loudest applause we can possibly give to Ed before the party.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Before we close this event, I would, on behalf of me and the Board of Student Society, give a few closing remarks. First of all, a huge thanks to Mr. Snowden for joining us all the way from Russia. And it has been amazing to hear his thoughts and opinions here tonight. And thank you to Claudio and Amnesty International for co-hosting this event and for facilitating this amazing conversation. Thank you to our technicians, videokomiteen, regi, and forsterkerkomiteen. Thank you to Café og Serveringsengen and to our marketing group. And thank you for everyone who's joined us here tonight. We're about 900 people here at Samfundet and over 1,200 who's watched online. So thank you all so much. And please don't linger here in Storsalen. If you want to stay at Samfundet, you can go to Edgar, Lykke, or Daglighallen. But we have to close this event now. Thank you so much.